and Commissioner Nunn and I are going to have to leave, but I would ask if your time permits, if you could chair the hearing and ask your further questions and also hear from Mr. Worthington. But I'd like to yield so that we could get over and talk. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding both this important hearing today, and we'll make sure that we move expeditiously here. But we want to talk about examining the lies and the duplicity of what the Chinese Communist Party has done, particularly when it comes to audits. China is not new to the realm of misinformation and deceptive practices. In fact, just a couple of months ago, this very commission reviewed the CCP's lies when it came to the inaccuracies in the Universal Periodic Review. Today, we're going to examine the CCP's abuse of third-party social audits to hide their use of forced slave labor in products used by everyday Americans, perhaps even many of us in this room. The truth is that China will stop at nothing to deceive the West and skirt our enforcement mechanisms as the administration has attempted to apply. The CCP continues the abuse of Uyghurs and other religious factions and illustrates that they will continue to commit genocide and crimes against humanity in order to fulfill the CCP's interest and that the exploit for distinct market advantage even against us here in the West. However, the CCP does not act alone. This is one of the things I want to focus in on today. As we will discuss, there are certain corporations and third-party actors have no issue in assisting the CCP in their maligned activities. In fact, I would offer the weaponization of social compliance audits indicates the CCP has strategically stacked the cards in their favor when it comes to uncovering forced and slave labor in their country. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to applaud you for taking on what is both a difficult issue, but one that has challenges both inside China and outside China. And I want to thank the witnesses for taking time to share your expertise with us today, as well as the Senate and the administration for being involved in this. So I'd like to begin with you, Mr. Worthington. You talked a lot about, the mining companies, the different aspects of this. Let's just ask the big question in the room. Are Western companies being compliant with the CCP and helping them hide their abuse of the use of Uyghur and other slave labor forces? And I ask that we top level.
Yeah, I think what's really clear, for example, from our research on Volkswagen, is that companies do have standards that they are applying outside China that they are not applying inside of China.
Do you think the CCP is playing a direct role in influencing these companies, either overtly or covertly?
I think it's certainly true when you talk to car company executives that the fear of reprisals that they face from the Chinese government is affecting how they're interacting with their own suppliers and their own staff in China.
Do we have blind spots when it comes to this? We certainly have it in the auditing side, but we hear the anecdotal evidence coming from companies. I'd like to know, where are we most out of information, or where are those gaps existing?
Yeah, so the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is an extremely effective piece of legislation in stopping products from coming into the US where they are linked to the Uyghur region, to Xinjiang. The question is, and this is the blind spot, what are the products that come from the Uyghur region? Because companies, like car companies, have thousands of suppliers, thousands of sub-suppliers, and at the moment they do not know whether or not some or many of those sub-suppliers are in fact sourcing from the Uyghur region.
So aside from the obvious monetary profit that these companies are getting, would you offer, are there other items behind why they would be standing with the CCP, rather than their perceived Western values of a free and independent labor force, when they know at some point in their supply chain they are exploiting a group of individuals for their own corporate profit? Are there other rationales why anyone would be doing this?
The reason, again, to take the example of the car industry, is that many of these companies have huge business in China, have huge financial interests in China, have huge joint ventures in China. And the decisions that they're taking are, of course, partly motivated by threats and reprisals from the government, and partly motivated by the fact that they have big business in China.
So by deterring this or calling it out, they would effectively be stepping away from China as a source of production for themselves.
Well, we've seen the risk, for example, with H&M, that where companies come out and say they're not going to source from the Uyghur region, they face reprisals both online in China and in terms of their market share.
I'm going to now ask Mr. Nova, you've done a lot on the social auditing side. How effectively do you believe social audits are on both uncovering as well as addressing the labor rights abuses that are coming out of the Uyghur region within China?
I think social auditing is an ineffective mechanism under the best of circumstances, and the situation in China represents the worst of circumstances in terms of the challenges and obstacles to auditing. So I do not believe reliable information is being developed. And indeed, I don't even think corporations are fully utilizing the options available to them to at least try to do it a little bit better. And just to speak quickly to your earlier question, I don't think there needs to be another motivation besides money. Corporations aren't in the business of values, they're in the business of profit for shareholders. And if making that profit requires bending their practices in such a way that it's acceptable to a host government, in this case, the most important host government, the Chinese, historically, they've been very happy to do that.
Well, Scott, I agree with you on aspects of that. I will hopefully highlight that we as consumers do have values, and that a lot of what drives our decision making is based on the fact that we don't exploit labor, that we don't use slave workforces in order to do it. We fought an entire civil war here in this country for this very purpose. And I would highlight, I think that you nailed it on the head here, we want to have visibility and transparency into this so that we as consumers can make informed choices and do hold those corporate entities, whether they're in China or here in the United States or elsewhere, accountable. So I guess my next question then is, who else besides just the government, which I think is performing admirably here, can help to hold these institutions accountable, particularly the multinational entities?
Well, there are, of course, other country governments, which also need to step up, and there's been some positive movement in Europe in this regard, I think following the lead of the United States government in terms of addressing this specific issue, so that's encouraging. You make a very important point about consumers, and there are consumer organizations, but consumers aren't a highly organized, highly mobilized constituency. If they were, I think we'd have very different supply chains, because you're absolutely right. Consumers don't want to be wearing clothing made with forced labor. They don't want the solar panels they're proud of installing on their roof to include polysilicon that was made with forced labor. And if consumers understood fully what was happening in supply chains globally, they would demand change. The primary function of social auditing is to shield the actual practices in the supply chains from the scrutiny of consumers, and thereby enable business as usual to continue even in the absence of a level of humaneness that consumers would consider minimally acceptable as consumers. And so we need to remove that shield and ensure that consumers can see what's actually happening. And if we succeed in that regard, then we will see change. Because at the end of the day, corporations need someone to sell their products to.
Mr. Nova, would not disagree with anything you just said. I think that's on mark. Let me ask then, are there success stories that we can point to for further replication that really highlight how do we provide the transparency, both to the consumers, both to the end user, as well as to the corporations themselves that are trying to acquire this, to know what is actually happening in China so that we can hold these folks accountable?
There are examples from other countries that are positive. I talked earlier in my testimony about the horrible situation in Bangladesh of workers dying in fires and structural collapses in buildings that had supposedly been inspected, factory buildings, by auditing firms. But after the worst of those disasters ultimately created enough pressure that more than 200 brands and retailers signed an enforceable agreement with worker representatives, not just to do inspections, but to clean up the buildings, to renovate the buildings and help pay for it, to make them safe. We then saw a radical physical transformation of the production infrastructure of the Bangladesh garment industry, resulting in concretely, demonstrably safer factories for more than 2.5 million garment workers. And a key component of that was that the results of the inspections done by the safety engineers, each hazard identified and the remedy necessary to correct it, was published, and the progress of each factory toward correcting each of those hazards was reported publicly on an ongoing basis. That is the opposite of what happens in the field of corporate social auditing, where nothing is public. The workers themselves don't see the results of the investigations that supposedly exist to protect their rights. But can you have in China an agreement like that? You spoke to this earlier, Secretary Li. Who signs an agreement on behalf of workers with corporations that speaks to what happens to workers in China? That's the challenge with replicating that model in the Chinese context.
I mean, I think we can speak to, millions of car owners here in the United States that potentially are going to have electric vehicles placed on them, or even want to do it for their own energy efficiency or social consciousness, don't want to know that that battery came from a cobalt mine that was done by a child labor force perpetrated by the Chinese on a country in Africa. I think that there's real requirement here for us not to do the facade of social auditing, but to have true transparency here. Thank you for your testimony. Deputy Undersecretary Lee, you've been a leader in this with the administration. Some of the recommendations that have been provided here, I wonder if you might share with us a little bit, if this transparency were to be provided, if we were able to have a better indication for not only Americans but consumers around the world, what roles can the administration do in enforcing this, hold China accountable, and ultimately make sure that we as the consumer have some kind of an insight into what's happening here so we can make our own market-driven choices?
Thank you so much, Mr. Nunn, for that question. I mean, I think transparent, accountable supply chains are essential, and it's something that in some ways we got away from in the go-go days of the global economy, where these complex and fractured supply chains exist so that corporations do not have to take responsibility. They don't have to know. But I think it's completely possible. It's just that we have to change the business culture to make it understandable, that everybody from the CEO on down in a company understands that, you know, obviously they're making purchasing decisions that require, you know, you decide where you're going to buy it from, what's the quality of it. There's quality control, there's price, there's everything else. You could, if you wanted to, know who the people were. So I think that we are working in that direction in the U.S. government in terms of both what's required by the Customs and Border Protection and enforcement of things, but also in terms of the international finance loans, in solar supply chains, looking for more transparency at every stage of the supply chain. So that is something that we are very committed to doing, and I think it's all good. It's good for consumers. Ultimately, it's good for businesses. They may resist it in the short term, but I think this is the way of the future, and I think we have a situation which is morally unacceptable if we don't have that transparency. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy Undersecretary Lee. Thank you, Chairman. And I would highlight, let's hold the bad actors accountable. Let's recognize the many who have tried to step out on this front to do the right thing, both as consumers and as corporate citizens, and ultimately recognize that the real threat here is coming from a government that has largely enforced a slave labor mentality on its own people inside the CCP, and the ultimate adversary here are the people who are allowing this to happen at the front end. But the threat happens both inside and outside of China. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Again, I'm sorry, we do have to leave. It's on zero over at the on the floor. And I really thank our distinguished commissioner for taking over the hearing. Without objection, a statement by Alicia Hennig will be made a part of the record. And again, I thank you so much for your recommendations and your testimony.